On a frozen mountain trail in Wyoming territory, a struggling cowboy finds a woman near death in a blizzard and risks everything to save her. What he doesn't know is that she's Governor Brennan's daughter, and this single act of mercy is about to transform his life in ways he never imagined. Before we begin, let us know where you're watching from in the comments below. The wind screamed through Snake River Pass like the devil himself was chasing it, whipping snow into blinding sheets that made the world disappear. Jed Hawkins pulled his worn Stetson lower over his eyes, squinting against the ice that stung his face like 1,000 tiny needles. His horse, a sturdy bay mare named Dust, trudged forward with her head down, nostrils flaring white clouds into the bitter cold. Behind him in the saddle, wrapped in every blanket he owned, sat his daughter Sarah. At 7 years old, she was small enough to tuck against his back, her thin arms wrapped around his waist, face buried in his sheepskin coat. He could feel her shivering even through all those layers, and it gnawed at him like a wolf at his ribs. They shouldn't have been out here, not in this. But the storm had rolled in faster than any February blizzard he'd seen in 15 years, and by the time he'd picked Sarah up from the schoolhouse in Copper Ridge, turning back wasn't an option. The trail home cut straight through the pass. It was either push through or freeze waiting it out in town with no money for a room. Jed's hands ached inside his leather gloves, fingers stiff from gripping the reins. His jaw was clenched so tight his teeth hurt. Every muscle in his body screamed from a 12-hour day breaking horses at the Maddox Ranch. But he didn't let himself think about that. He just thought about the cabin, the fireplace, hot coffee, getting Sarah warm. The pass narrowed ahead, where the trail curved along the ridge, pine trees thick on one side, a steep drop on the other. Visibility was near nothing, just white and gray, and the dark shapes of trees like ghosts in the storm. Dust's ears swiveled forward suddenly, and she nickered low, uneasy. "Easy, girl," Jed murmured, his voice rough and half-frozen. Then he saw it. A dark shape off to the left, barely visible through the snow. At first, he thought it was a fallen tree, or maybe a deer carcass. But as Dust drew closer, his stomach dropped. It was a horse, lying on its side in the snow, unmoving, dead by the look of it. And a few feet beyond, half buried in a drift near the base of a pine, was a figure, a person, dressed in dark clothing, motionless, dusted white with snow. "Damn," Jed whispered. He reined Dust to a stop and swung down stiffly, boots crunching into the knee-deep snow. "Stay put, darlin'," he said to Sarah, his voice firm but gentle. She nodded against his back, too cold and tired to argue. Jed waded through the drifts toward the figure, his heart pounding now, dread rising in his chest. Please don't be dead. Please don't be dead. He dropped to his knees beside the person and brushed the snow away from their face. A woman, young, maybe mid-20s, pale as death, lips blue, eyes closed. Ice clung to her dark hair, and her fine wool coat, though well-made, was soaked through. She wasn't moving, wasn't breathing that he could see. "Ma'am!" Jed shouted over the wind, shaking her shoulder. Nothing. He pressed 2 fingers to her neck, just below her frozen jaw, and felt it. Faint, barely there. But a pulse. She was alive, barely. He didn't think, didn't hesitate. He scooped her up in his arms, dead weight and cold as stone, and carried her back to Dust. The mare shifted nervously, but held steady, as Jed hoisted the woman up and draped her across the saddle in front of him. Sarah made a small sound of surprise behind him. "Daddy, who is she?" "Don't know, baby girl," Jed said, his voice tight. "But she ain't gonna make it if we don't get her warm." He pulled himself up behind the woman, holding her against his chest with one arm, reins in the other. Her head lolled against his shoulder, lifeless, and then he kicked Dust into motion, urging her forward through the howling storm, praying they'd make it home before it was too late. The journey back to the cabin felt like riding through hell frozen over. Every gust of wind tried to rip them off the trail, and Jed could barely see 5 feet ahead. The woman in his arms was a dead weight, her body limp and cold as a corpse. And that terrified him more than the storm itself. He'd seen men freeze to death before, knew how quiet it was, how they just slipped away without a sound. "Hold on," he muttered to her, though he knew she couldn't hear him. "Just hold on." Sarah pressed closer against his back, her small voice muffled by the wind. "Is she gonna die, Daddy?" "Not if I can help it," Jed said, his jaw set hard. Dust stumbled once on the icy trail, and Jed's heart lurched into his throat. If the mare went down, they were all finished. But she caught herself, snorted hard, and pushed forward with the kind of stubborn strength that made him love that horse more than any creature on earth. The cold was savage now, biting through his coat, his gloves, his bones. His fingers were numb on the reins, and he couldn't feel his feet in his boots anymore. The woman's face was pressed against his chest, her breathing so shallow he had to strain to feel it. Ice crystals clung to her eyelashes, and her skin had gone from pale to gray. He tried to shield her from the wind as best he could, tucking her head under his chin, wrapping his coat around her as much as possible, but it wasn't enough. Nothing was enough out here. "Come on, Dust," he urged, his voice raw. "Get us home, girl. Get us home." The minutes stretched into what felt like hours. The world was nothing but white noise and freezing air and the rhythmic crunch of Dust's hooves through the snow. Jed's mind started to wander, exhaustion creeping in, but he forced himself to stay sharp. He thought about the fire he'd need to build the moment they got inside. The blankets, warm water. Anything to pull this woman back from the edge. He didn't know who she was, didn't know why she'd been out here alone, or where she'd been heading. Her clothes were fine, too fine for someone traveling these trails without an escort or a guide. Her coat was tailored, her boots expensive leather, now ruined by the snow. Whoever she was, she didn't belong out here. But none of that mattered now. Finally, through the swirling white, he saw it. The dark shape of his cabin, small and humble, tucked into the trees at the edge of a clearing. Smoke should have been rising from the chimney, but the fire had long since died. Still, it was shelter. It was home. "We made it, Sarah," he said, his voice thick with relief. "I'm cold, Daddy," she whimpered. "I know, baby. We're gonna get warm now, I promise." Jed guided Dust right up to the porch and dismounted carefully, pulling the woman down with him. She was heavier than she looked, or maybe he was just that tired. He kicked the cabin door open with his boot and carried her inside, the darkness and cold of the interior hitting him like a wall. He laid her down on the old couch near the stone fireplace, her body slack and unresponsive. Sarah slipped off Dust and hurried inside behind him, shivering violently, her lips trembling. "Sarah, get the kindling from the box," Jed ordered, already moving. "Fast as you can." She nodded and ran to obey, her little hands fumbling with the wood. Jed knelt beside the woman, pulling off her frozen gloves, her soaked coat, her boots. Her fingers were like ice, stiff and pale. He rubbed them between his hands, trying to get the blood moving, but there was barely any warmth left in her. He grabbed every blanket in the cabin, piling them over her, then turned to the fireplace. His hands shook as he struck the flint, once, twice, 3 times before the spark caught. The kindling crackled to life, and he fed it carefully, building the flame until it roared. Heat began to fill the small room, and Jed finally let himself breathe. He knelt beside the woman again, pressing his fingers to her neck. The pulse was still there, faint but steady. "Come on," he whispered. "Don't you quit on me now." The fire crackled and popped, throwing dancing shadows across the cabin walls as warmth slowly began to seep back into the room. Jed worked quickly, his movements practiced and deliberate despite the exhaustion weighing on him like wet wool. He'd pulled the couch as close to the fireplace as he dared, and now the woman lay buried beneath every quilt and blanket he owned. Her face was still pale, but the deathly gray had started to fade. That was something. That was hope. Jed filled a dented tin pot with water from the bucket by the door and hung it over the fire on an iron hook. While it heated, he knelt beside her again, checking her pulse, her breathing, the color returning slowly to her fingertips. Her dark hair was still damp, plastered against her forehead, and he carefully brushed it back, his rough hands surprisingly gentle. "Daddy." Sarah's small voice came from behind him. She stood near the table, still wrapped in her coat, watching with wide, worried eyes. "Come here, darlin'," Jed said softly, holding out one arm. She ran to him and buried her face against his shoulder. He held her tight for a moment, feeling her trembling, feeling the cold still clinging to her small body. "Is she going to wake up?" Sarah whispered. "I hope so," Jed said honestly, "but she needs time, needs to get warm again." He stood and moved Sarah closer to the fire, helping her out of her wet coat and boots, wrapping one of the thinner blankets around her shoulders. "You stay right here where it's warm, you hear me? I'm going to tend to her." Sarah nodded, her eyes never leaving the stranger on the couch. The water in the pot began to steam, and Jed pulled it off the fire, pouring some into a chipped ceramic mug. He added a spoonful of honey from the jar on the shelf and stirred it slowly, the sweet smell filling the cabin. It wasn't much, but it was warm, and warm was what she needed. He sat on the edge of the couch, lifting the woman's head carefully, cradling it in the crook of his arm. Her eyes were still closed, her breathing shallow but steady now. He pressed the rim of the mug gently to her lips. "Come on now," he murmured. "Just a little." At first nothing. Then her throat moved, just slightly, and a trickle of the warm liquid slipped past her lips. She coughed weakly, her body stirring for the first time, and Jed's heart jumped. "That's it," he said quietly. "That's it. Come back now." He gave her another small sip, then another, and her eyelids fluttered. Slowly, like she was fighting her way up from the bottom of a frozen lake, her eyes opened. They were blue, pale blue like winter sky, and they stared up at him, unfocused, confused, afraid. "Easy," Jed said, his voice low and steady. "You're safe. You're inside. You're gonna be all right." She blinked, her lips parting, trying to form words, but nothing came out. Her gaze darted around the small cabin, taking in the rough-hewn walls, the crackling fire, the little girl sitting nearby wrapped in a blanket. "Where?" Her voice was barely a whisper, hoarse and broken. "My cabin," Jed said, "just outside Copper Ridge. Found you on the trail in the pass. You were near froze to death." Her eyes came back to his, and for a long moment, she just stared at him. Then her face crumpled slightly, and her voice cracked. "My horse." "Didn't make it," Jed said gently. "I'm sorry." She closed her eyes, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Jed looked away, giving her that moment, then set the mug down on the floor beside the couch. Sarah shifted closer, dragging her blanket with her, and stopped just a few feet from the woman. She tilted her head, her expression serious. "Are you a princess?" Sarah asked suddenly. The woman's eyes opened again, surprised, and the faintest hint of a smile touched her lips despite everything. "No, sweetheart," she whispered. "I'm not a princess." "You look like one," Sarah said matter-of-factly. Then she stepped forward and carefully draped her own blanket over the woman's legs. "This one's mine. It's got horses on it. It's real warm." The woman's breath caught, and she looked at the little girl with something like wonder in her eyes. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. Sarah smiled shyly, then climbed up onto the arm of the couch, sitting there like a little guardian. Jed watched them both, something tightening in his chest. He didn't know who this woman was, didn't know why she'd been out there alone, but right now, in this moment, none of that mattered. She was alive, and she was safe. That was enough. 2 days passed before the storm finally broke. The wind died down to a whisper, and the sun emerged pale and cold over the snow-covered landscape, turning everything into a blinding field of white. The woman, who'd finally told them her name was Kate, had regained her strength slowly, spending most of the first day sleeping by the fire while Jed kept watch, and Sarah brought her cups of honeyed tea like a devoted nurse. By the second morning, Kate was sitting up on her own, color returned to her cheeks, though her eyes still carried the shadow of how close she'd come to dying. She'd been quiet mostly, polite but distant, answering Jed's questions with careful brevity. She'd been traveling from Cheyenne to visit family in Montana, she said. Took a shortcut through the pass against her guide's advice. The storm caught her, her horse panicked and went down, and the rest was a blur of cold and darkness. She didn't offer more than that, and Jed didn't press. Folks had their reasons for keeping things private, and he respected that. On the morning of the third day, Jed stood on the porch, surveying the clearing. The snow had stopped, but the drifts were still deep, and the trail would be treacherous for days. Still, he knew she'd want to leave soon. Women like her, refined and educated, didn't belong in a place like this. She'd been gracious about it all, but he could see it in the way she glanced at the rough wooden walls, the patched roof, the cracked dishes. This wasn't her world. He pulled on his coat and headed to the small lean-to where Dust was stabled. The mare nickered softly as he entered, her breath steaming in the cold air. He'd need to rig up something for Kate to ride. Maybe fashion a travois, get her to town where she could send word to her family, arrange proper transport. But when he came back inside, an hour later, brushing snow off his shoulders, Kate was standing by the window, fully dressed, in her now dry traveling clothes. She turned to face him, and there was something different in her expression, resolved. "I need to get to Copper Ridge," she said, "as soon as possible." Jed nodded. "Trail's still rough, but Dust can make it. I can take you in today if you're strong enough." "I am," Kate said firmly, then softer. "Thank you. For everything. I know I've been an imposition." "You ain't been nothing of the sort," Jed said, shaking his head. "Any decent person would have done the same." Kate's eyes held his for a moment, something unreadable passing through them. "No," she said quietly. "They wouldn't have." An hour later they were ready. Jed had saddled Dust and helped Kate up, then lifted Sarah up behind her. The little girl wrapped her arms around Kate's waist, chattering excitedly about going to town. Kate smiled down at her, that same soft expression she'd worn when Sarah had given her the blanket. The ride to Copper Ridge took most of the morning. The trail was slow going, but Dust was sure-footed and the sky stayed clear. They didn't talk much. Kate seemed lost in thought, her gaze fixed on the horizon, and Jed let her be. When they finally reached the edge of town, Kate spoke. "Take me to the telegraph office." Jed guided Dust down the main street, past the general store and the saloon, to the small wooden building with the telegraph lines running overhead. He helped Kate down, and she stood there for a moment, brushing snow from her skirt, gathering herself. "I'll wait here," Jed said, tipping his hat. Kate looked at him, and for the first time, something like regret crossed her face. "Jed," she said, her voice careful, "I haven't been entirely honest with you." He frowned slightly, waiting. "My full name is Catherine Brennan," she said. "My father is Governor Thomas Brennan." The words hit him like a punch to the chest. He stared at her, speechless, his mind racing. The governor's daughter. He'd pulled the governor's daughter out of a snowdrift and brought her to his falling-down cabin with its leaking roof and cracked dishes. "I didn't tell you because I wanted," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "I wanted to be just Kate, for a little while. To be treated like a person, not a name." Jed swallowed hard, his hat suddenly feeling too tight in his hands. "Ma'am, I—" "Don't," Kate said gently. "Please, you treated me with more kindness and dignity than most people ever have. You asked for nothing, expected nothing." Her eyes glistened. "That's rare, especially for someone like me." She reached out and squeezed his hand once, briefly. "I won't forget this, Jed Hawkins. I promise you that." Then she turned and walked into the telegraph office, leaving him standing there in the snow, the world tilting slightly beneath his feet. 3 weeks passed, and the snow in Copper Ridge began its slow surrender to early spring. Icicles dripped from rooftops in the afternoon sun, and the frozen ground turned to mud that sucked at boots and wagon wheels. The mountains still wore their white caps, but down in the valley, life was thawing out, shaking off winter's grip. Jed's days fell back into their familiar rhythm like a worn saddle finding its shape again. Up before dawn, coffee boiled bitter and strong over the fire, then out to the Maddox ranch to work the horses. His hands still ached from the cold that had settled deep in his joints, and his back protested every morning when he swung into the saddle, but he didn't complain. Work was work, and work kept food on the table. Sarah went back to school, trudging through the mud each morning with her slate tucked under her arm and her lunch pail swinging at her side. She talked about Kate sometimes, asking when the pretty lady would come visit, wondering if she'd made it home safe to her family. Jed would smile and tell her yes, she'd made it home just fine, and that would be the end of it. But there were moments when Jed's mind would wander back to those 3 days, when he'd pause in the middle of shoeing a horse or mending a fence post, and he'd remember the weight of her in his arms as he'd carried her through the storm. The look in her pale blue eyes when she'd first woken up, confused and afraid and grateful all at once. The way she'd smiled at Sarah when his daughter had draped that blanket over her legs. The governor's daughter. He still couldn't quite wrap his head around it. He'd shared his table with the governor's daughter. She'd slept on his threadbare couch, drunk from his chipped mug, worn his dead wife's old shawl to keep warm, and he'd never known, never suspected. Part of him was glad he hadn't known. If he had, he might have acted different, might have been stiff and formal and strange about it all, but not knowing had let him just be himself, just be Jed. Still, a hollow feeling had settled in his chest those first few days after he'd left her at the telegraph office. He'd watched her walk inside, straight-backed and composed despite everything she'd been through, and he'd known that was the last time he'd ever see her. Women like that didn't come back to places like this. They returned to their big houses and their important families and their lives that had nothing to do with broke cowboys living in leaky cabins. He didn't begrudge her that. It was just the way of things. The ranch hands had ribbed him about it when word got around town. Half of Copper Ridge had seen him ride in with a fine-dressed woman on his horse, and gossip spread faster than wildfire in a place this small. They'd asked him 100 questions he couldn't or wouldn't answer, and eventually they'd moved on to other talk. A saloon fight, a missing cow, some prospector claiming he'd found silver up near Red Canyon. Life went on the way it always did. One evening, after a particularly long day of breaking a stubborn roan that had thrown him twice, Jed sat on his porch watching the sun sink behind the mountains. The sky burned orange and purple, and the air smelled like pine and thawing earth. Sarah was inside doing her sums by lamplight, her tongue poking out the corner of her mouth the way it always did when she was concentrating hard. He'd patched the worst of the roof leaks the week before, but there were still a dozen things that needed fixing. The front step was rotting through. The door hung crooked on its hinges. The stove smoked something terrible when the wind came from the north. He'd get to it all eventually, piece by piece, the same way he'd been getting to things for the past 5 years since Mary died. Jed took a long breath and let it out slow, watching his breath fog in the cooling air. He thought about Kate one more time, wondered if she was warm and safe in whatever grand house she called home. Wondered if she ever thought about the cowboy who'd pulled her out of the snow. Probably not, and that was fine. He'd done what any decent man would do, and that was enough. It had to be. The extraordinary had folded itself back into the ordinary, and Jed Hawkins was exactly where he'd always been, alone except for Sarah, working hard, getting by, and expecting nothing from a world that had never given him much to begin with. He stood up, brushed the dust off his pants, and went inside to check on his daughter's arithmetic. The letter arrived on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by a writer Jed had never seen before. Not the usual mail carrier from town, but a young man in a clean suit riding a well-bred chestnut, the kind of horse that cost more than Jed made in 6 months. The man dismounted in front of the cabin, glanced around at the modest homestead with barely concealed judgment, and held out a thick envelope sealed with red wax. "Jed Hawkins, Wems?" he asked, his tone clipped and professional. "That's me," Jed said, wiping his hands on his pants. He'd been splitting wood out back and was covered in dust and wood chips. "Delivery from Cheyenne. Sign here." The man produced a ledger and a pencil. Jed scrawled his name, took the envelope, and watched the rider mount up and leave without another word, hoofbeats fading down the trail. He turned the envelope over in his hands, frowning. The paper was heavy, expensive. His name was written across the front in elegant script that made his rough handwriting in the ledger look like chicken scratches. The seal bore an emblem he didn't recognize. Sarah came running out from behind the cabin, her dress muddy at the hem. "Who was that, Daddy?" "Don't know," Jed said slowly, still staring at the envelope. "Brought a letter." "What's it say?" "Haven't opened it yet." He walked to the porch and sat down on the top step, Sarah plopping down beside him, her eyes wide with curiosity. Jed broke the seal carefully and pulled out the contents. 2 folded sheets of paper, the first one a letter written in the same elegant hand as the envelope. He unfolded it and began to read. "Dear Jed, I have started this letter a dozen times, and each time the words feel insufficient. How do you thank someone for saving your life? How do you repay a kindness given without hesitation, without expectation, without any thought of reward? You didn't know who I was when you found me on that trail. You saw someone in need and you acted. You opened your home, shared what little you had, and asked for nothing in return. Your daughter gave me her blanket. You gave me warmth and safety and dignity when I had none. I have spent my entire life surrounded by people who want something from me. My father's name opens doors, but it also brings out the worst in people. Greed, ambition, false kindness that evaporates the moment it's no longer useful. But you, Jed Hawkins, you showed me something I had almost forgotten existed. Decency. Real, unvarnished human decency. I told you my name in that telegraph office because I owed you the truth. But I also told you because I wanted you to know that what you did mattered. It mattered to me, and it will matter to others because of what I am about to do." Jed's hands were shaking now. He glanced at Sarah, who was trying to read over his shoulder, her lips moving silently as she sounded out the words. He kept reading. "My father has agreed to establish a new territorial land office in Copper Ridge, and he has authorized me to oversee the distribution of homestead grants in the region. I am using my influence to ensure that good people like you who have worked hard and asked for nothing, are finally given what they deserve. Enclosed with this letter is a land deed, 200 acres of grazing land south of Copper Ridge along Willow Creek, plus timber rights and water access. The land is yours, Jed, free and clear, no payments, no conditions. It is yours because you earned it, not through politics or money, but through the content of your character. I have also arranged for a line of credit at the Copper Ridge Bank in your name, enough to build a proper house, buy cattle, start fresh, build the life you and Sarah deserve." Jed stopped reading. His vision blurred, and he realized his eyes were burning. He blinked hard, his throat tight, his chest aching with something he couldn't name. "Daddy?" Sarah's voice was small, uncertain. "What's wrong?" He looked down at the second sheet of paper. It was official, stamped and signed, the territorial seal embossed at the top. A land deed, his name written clear as day. Jedediah Hawkins, 200 acres. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. The world had tilted on its axis, and everything he thought he knew about his life, about his future, had just shattered and reformed into something he'd never dared imagine. "Daddy, you're crying," Sarah whispered, her hand touching his arm. Jed wiped his face roughly with the back of his hand and pulled his daughter close, holding her tight against his side. His voice came out rough and broken. "Yeah, baby girl," he said. "I am." Jed sat on that porch step for a long time, the letter trembling in his hands. Sarah pressed against his side. The words on the page blurred and refocused as he read them again, then a third time, as if repetition would somehow make them more real, more believable. 200 acres, land of his own, not rented, not borrowed, not worked for someone else's profit, his. He'd spent 15 years breaking his back for other men, living in a cabin that leaked when it rained and let the cold seep through the cracks in winter. He'd buried his wife in a grave he couldn't afford to mark with anything better than a wooden cross he'd carved himself. He'd watched Sarah grow up in patched dresses and shoes worn through at the toes, and every single day he'd told himself it was enough, that they were getting by, that things could be worse. And now this. The paper felt almost too heavy to hold, weighted with possibility, with a future he'd stopped letting himself imagine years ago. His hands shook as he set the letter down carefully on the step beside him and picked up the deed, running his calloused fingers over the official stamps, the flowing script that spelled out his name. "What does it mean, Daddy?" Sarah asked, her voice quiet and full of wonder. Jed looked down at his daughter, at her wide brown eyes and the smudge of dirt on her cheek, and something broke open inside his chest. Not painfully, but like a dam giving way after holding back too much for too long. "It means," he said, his voice thick and unsteady, "it means we got land now, baby girl. 200 acres down by Willow Creek, good land, with water and timber and grass for cattle." Sarah's eyes went even wider. "Our land? Like we don't have to leave?" "Our land," Jed confirmed, his throat tight. "Ain't nobody can take it from us." She threw her arms around his neck, and he held her close, burying his face in her hair, breathing in the smell of sunshine and childhood and hope. His shoulders shook, and he didn't try to hide it anymore. The tears came hard and fast, years of exhaustion and worry and quiet desperation pouring out of him. He'd saved a woman's life because it was the right thing to do, because leaving her to die in that storm wasn't something he could live with. He hadn't done it for reward or recognition or gratitude. He'd done it because that's what decent people did. And somehow, impossibly, the world had seen him, really seen him, not as a broke cowboy barely scraping by, not as a widower raising a daughter alone in a falling-down cabin, but as a man with dignity, a man worthy of something better. "You know what this means?" Jed said, pulling back to look at Sarah, wiping his eyes with his sleeve. She shook her head, her own eyes shining. "Means we can build us a proper house," he said, his voice gaining strength. "With rooms that don't leak and a stove that don't smoke. Means I can buy cattle, start a real herd. Means you can have new dresses that ain't hand-me-downs, and books for school, and maybe even a pony of your own if you want one." Sarah's face lit up like the sun breaking through clouds. "A pony?" "A pony," Jed said, laughing now through the tears, the sound raw and genuine. "And maybe chickens, too, so we can have fresh eggs every morning. And a garden. Your mama always wanted a big garden." He looked out across the clearing, but he wasn't seeing the patched cabin or the leaning fence anymore. He was seeing what could be, what would be. A house with solid walls and glass windows. Pastures filled with cattle bearing his brand. Sarah running through fields that belonged to them, laughing and safe and provided for. "Why'd she do it?" Sarah asked suddenly. "The pretty lady. Why'd she give us all this?" Jed was quiet for a moment, thinking about Kate's words in the letter, about decency and dignity and kindness without expectation. He thought about the way she'd looked at him in that telegraph office, like he'd given her something precious she hadn't known she was missing. "Because sometimes," he said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "when you do something good, not for thanks or reward, but just because it's right, it comes back to you. Maybe not always like this, maybe not always so big, but it comes back." He pulled the letter close again, reading the final lines he hadn't gotten to before. "You reminded me what it means to be good without audience or applause. You reminded me that character isn't about station or wealth, but about what you do when no one is watching, when there's nothing to gain. Thank you, Jed Hawkins, for saving my life. And thank you for reminding me what kind of person I want to be. With deepest gratitude and respect, Catherine Brennan Starr." Jed folded the letter carefully and slipped it back into the envelope. He stood up, Sarah's hand in his, and looked out at the mountains rising in the distance, snow-capped and eternal. For the first time in longer than he could remember, the future didn't feel like something to survive. It felt like something to build. The sun was setting over the Wyoming mountains, painting the sky in shades of gold and deep purple that made the snow-capped peaks glow like they were lit from within. Jed stood in the clearing in front of the cabin, the deed and letter still clutched in his hand, and for the first time in 5 years, he let himself feel the full weight of everything he'd carried. The loneliness, the fear, the endless grind of making every dollar stretch, every decision calculated against the risk of failing Sarah, and now the overwhelming gratitude and disbelief that someone had seen him, truly seen him, and deemed him worthy of more. Sarah tugged on his sleeve. "Daddy, can we go see the land? Our land?" Jed looked down at her, at the hope shining in her eyes, and he smiled. A real smile, the kind that reached all the way down to the hollowed-out places in his chest and filled them with something warm. "Tomorrow," he promised. "First light, we'll ride down to Willow Creek and walk every inch of it. See where we're going to build our house." "And the pony pasture?" she asked eagerly. "And the pony pasture," he confirmed, laughing softly. She squeezed his hand tight, then looked up at him with that serious expression she got sometimes, the one that made her look far older than 7. "That lady, Miss Kate, she was real nice." "She was," Jed agreed. "I'm glad you saved her." "Me too, baby girl, me too." Sarah yawned then, the excitement and emotion of the day finally catching up with her. Jed scooped her up in his arms, even though she was getting too big for it, and carried her inside. He tucked her into bed fully clothed, too tired himself to fuss with getting her into a nightgown, and pulled the blanket up to her chin, the one with the horses on it, the one she'd given to Kate. "Daddy," she mumbled, already half asleep. "Yeah, you're a good person. The best person." His throat tightened again, and he smoothed her hair back from her forehead, pressing a kiss there. "You are too, sweetheart. Don't ever forget that." She was asleep before he even left the room. Jed returned to the porch, settling into the old rocking chair that creaked under his weight. He reread the letter one more time in the fading light, committing every word to memory. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in his shirt pocket, right over his heart. The evening was quiet, except for the gentle sounds of the forest settling in for the night. Somewhere in the distance, an owl hooted. The wind whispered through the pine trees, no longer carrying the bite of winter, but the promise of spring. He thought about Kate, wondered where she was right now. Probably back in Cheyenne, in some grand governor's mansion, with polished floors and crystal chandeliers, maybe sitting at a mahogany desk, writing more letters, making more decisions that would change people's lives. He hoped she was warm, hoped she was happy, hoped she knew that what she'd done for him and Sarah wasn't just about the land or the money. It was about being seen, being valued, being told that his life, his character, his choices, they mattered. Miles away in Cheyenne, in a well-appointed study lined with books and warmed by a marble fireplace, Catherine Brennan stood by the window looking out at the same sunset. In her hand, she held a telegram that had arrived that afternoon, simple and direct. "Letter received. No words sufficient. Thank you. Will make you proud. J. Hawkins." She smiled, pressing the telegram against her chest, and for the first time since that night on the frozen trail, she felt truly warm. Not from the fire or the expensive wool of her dress, but from something deeper, something that had been missing from her life for far too long: purpose, connection, the knowledge that wealth and position meant nothing if they weren't used to lift others up. She thought about Jed's rough hands carefully pouring her tea, about little Sarah draping a blanket over her with such solemn tenderness, about the way they'd given everything without counting the cost, without measuring what they might receive in return. They had saved her life, yes, but they'd done something more than that. They'd reminded her what it meant to be human. Kate tucked the telegram into the drawer of her desk, next to the memory of 3 days in a humble cabin where she'd been treated with more genuine kindness than she'd known in all her years among society and politics. She made a silent promise to herself. She would use her position, her influence, her father's name, not for personal gain or political advantage, but to find more people like Jed Hawkins, people of character and quiet dignity who deserve to be seen, to be valued, to be given the chance they'd earned through the content of their hearts. Back in Copper Ridge, Jed Hawkins rocked slowly in his chair, watching the stars emerge one by one in the darkening sky. Tomorrow would bring new beginnings. Hard work still, certainly, but work towards something that belonged to him and Sarah. Work that would build a future instead of just surviving another day. But tonight he simply sat in the peace of knowing that kindness, real and unconditional, had come full circle. That the world, cold and harsh as it could be, still had room for grace. Two strangers had met in a storm, and both their lives had changed forever, not because of station or wealth or destiny, but because one man had chosen decency when it would have been easier to ride past, and one woman had chosen gratitude over entitlement, generosity over indifference. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of pine and coming rain. Jed breathed it in deep, closed his eyes, and smiled. He was home. And for the first time in a long time, home felt like enough. More than enough. It felt like everything. If this story touched your heart, let us know in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of courage, kindness, and the moments that change everything.